Hello OSA. Today we're going to be talking about something near and dear to my heart and quite frankly the future of the entire aquarium industry. And that's aquaculture. Specifically today we're going to be doing a very brief introduction into marine finfish aquaculture. Back in the day, way back in the day, most aquarium keeping was freshwater. It was mainly done by wild capture. All of these fish would be extracted from places like South America and Africa, Asia, India, etc. They would be shipped off, a quarter of them would survive, and then from that quarter even less would survive, and then when the masses ran out, more and more wild individuals would be recruited and harvested. Now this model in time only increased in scale and increased in scope as the world became more and more connected and the aquarium industry spread to new countries and new demographics, and thus the hunger for aquarium organisms increased and diversified. And this created, as you can quite imagine, disasters, especially now into the 21st century as we're really starting to see the toll that this is playing on both freshwater stocks and now, most critically, reef stocks. Now, we'll go back very briefly back to the 20th century when all of the freshwater fish started to be depleted for the most part. Most of your staple freshwater fish that we have today, your angelfish, many of your loaches, many of your tetras, a lot of these fish species were entirely wild caught until they became very expensive and more difficult to acquire in the wild. So as a result, farming operations were conducted in many of the countries which naturally have these critters, and then also, controversially, in nations which the critters were not native to. But long story short, we had freshwater aquaculture for ornamental purposes, for making just colorful freshwater critters for aquariums bloom. And this made this whole industry where it was no longer just down to a select couple of people in the village going out and extracting their natural resource, but now you had a resource that could be established in new communities and sold. So that's a very brief introduction into freshwater aquaculture. Where we are today is marine organisms. Inverts, and especially fish, cannot be bred nearly as easily as freshwater organisms. So with a neon tetra, anyone can more or less breed them in their living room. All you need is a couple side tanks, and perhaps we'll do a video on that. It just requires a little bit of knowledge on what exactly you're doing. With many of these organisms that you see before me, that is not the case. Not only can one simply not have the infrastructure required to raise the larvae of all these organisms inside, a house, but science, in fact, does not necessarily understand all the different larval stages of all these different organisms. So because of that, even organisms that people would love to farm, people would love to provide a cheap and constant supply of, this simply isn't possible due to the technological and biological limitations, what we even know about how the critters work. These skunk cleaner shrimp alone, you think of them as just a shrimp, but they have a larval state which is floating out there in the middle of the ocean for months at a time. You can't have something as fragile as a snowflake inside your living room, let alone grow it at scale for 4 or 6 months. We simply don't have the technology or techniques yet to make that economically viable. And for that reason, many, many more organisms are wild caught than are farmed. Now, we'll talk about an example of a marine organism, a fish, that everyone loved, that became extremely taxed in the wild, but now is basically the vanguard for how sustainable aquacultured marine fish are not only possible, but the inevitable future of the industry. So, the clownfish, right? Really cute. Amphitryon ocellaris. Baby pergola if you're willing to spend the money. But mostly Amphitryon ocellaris. It's your brand name Nemo fish. Something happened in the beginning of the 21st century in the early 2000s. Something that was wonderful for humanity, but in a way extremely devastating to all marine life. And that event was the movie Finding Nemo coming out. After Finding Nemo, there was a tsunami of consumer demand for every single child in America and in various other countries wanted their very own Nemo fish and therefore wanted their own saltwater tank at home. This created a huge tidal wave of consumption of Amphitryon ocellarises extracted from the wild at an extremely cheap price, And as many people know, after going through, purchasing your first land hermit crab or Japanese firebelly newt, just because something's sold in a mall or something's sold very conveniently doesn't necessarily mean that it's not an organism that requires things that you're not necessarily prepared to take care of when you just bring it home on a whim. So as a result of this huge consumer demand, we had a conjunction effect where Finfish ocellaris anemone fish were being extracted en masse from the wild in a way that they had never been so before, and they were being killed because they are a relatively bulletproof reef fish, but they were being killed on a scale that they weren't being used to as well. So this cycling devastated many populations. So eventually, this skyrocketed the localized price of the Finfish ocellaris, and as a result, they had to be farmed. It didn't take very long into the early 2000s where clownfish were aquacultured successfully. Basically, those papers were then published so that aquarists far and wide, inside their basements and in marine labs and in public aquaria alike, were all able to take their successful paired clownfish specimens and they were able to breed them and replicate them. This led to commercialized farming in the early 2000s, where not only could a tidal wave more of captive raised, really sturdy anemone fish be supplied into the market, but new cool things could happen. One, these fish were raised completely in a farm-raised tank setting, so they didn't have nearly the transport stress or overall stress and death rates that wild-caught fish had. They were already accustomed to pelleted feeds, so they weren't very finicky, and they didn't need to have live feeds, and they had a lot more resiliency. They could be kept track of and pre-treated so that they could be assured from the farmer that they were disease-free to an extent. And even more interestingly, just like we did with dogs, cows, chickens, axolotls, ball pythons, and just as we will do with every critter that we bring into our home as pets, we turn them into something new. So you can see here some textbook Finfish ocellaris, but here to the right, we can see some long-fin clownfish as well. Now these won't occur in the wild because they're absolutely silly and they would get consumed immediately and nature wouldn't allow that. But in our tanks and in our farms, we've been able to make all kinds of different Picasso clownfish and mosaic clownfish and chocolate clownfish and all these different strains of clownfish that never would exist in the wild, but now we can have in our tanks. And in my opinion, that's the most beautiful thing aquaculture can do. Not only can it reconcile the need to rapidly consume all those different wild critters, we can make critters for our own tanks and be sustainable and ethical about it, but at the same time, we're creating something new. A new, novel beauty, a pastoral, something where humanity and nature has met to create something new and beautiful at the same time. So, one of the great things about the future is that many more people will learn more and more things about more and more organisms in the marine environment, and we'll be able to farm them, breed them, make them more sustainable, make them cheaper, make them more disease resistant, make them better able to be in tanks, and honestly make them new fancy cool colors.